Hello. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering a couple common bad practices that beginning Python developers make. These bad practices often make programming slower, harder to read, more complicated, and overall are bad practice for a work environment. The way that I'm going to be displaying this is by helping create what we can imagine as a function that a bank would use to transfer funds. This function will be able to take money out of a savings account and putting it into a checking and vice versa. Then what we're going to do is break down what we did wrong and how we can change it. So what we're going to need to start by doing is defining a function called transfer. And this function is going to take three arguments. It's going to take the amount in savings, the amount in checking, and the starting account that you're using. So for example, if you were to transfer 50 from savings into checking, that would be different than transferring 50 from checking into savings. So we need logic to control where we're moving the money around. So we need to know where to start from. What we can do then is add that logic, saying if start is savings or if it's checking. The next logical step is to see how much the user wants to transfer. What we can do for this is get input from the user. We can create a variable called amount and call this input function. Now, within these quotes, I can type how much would you like to transfer? And what that'll do is print on the screen what we want to say before we allow the user to add input. And whatever the input is going to be in this amount. And the next thing we need to do is transfer the money. In this case, it would be subtract from savings and add to checking. So what we can do is take our savings variable and use the minus equal operator to subtract the amount. And we can do vice versa with checking. Now right now we have a small issue with our program. Right now it's trying to take savings and subtract amount. But amount isn't necessarily a number right now. Because we got the input from the terminal or from the application, this is a string, even if it's just numbers. So we have two options here. We can convert this to an integer or a floating point number. The difference being floating point numbers have decimals. And that's exactly what we need, because what if they want to transfer $10.5? Now luckily Python has a function for this, where all we have to do is type float around the number that we want to convert from a string to a float. Similarly, we can add this logic to the checking account and then reverse the order of operations for the saving and checking. The final thing that we need to do for both of these is return. We'll start with the savings and then the checking. Now we need to call our function. We need to call transfer and then insert a savings. In this case, we will say 1,000, a checking, in this case 500, and then where we're going to start. In this case, we can start from savings. Now, if I were to run this right now, it wouldn't return anything because we're not actually printing it to the screen. It is returning, but we won't be able to see it. So in order to see it, we need to print the value that this returns. Now if we run the function, it'll give us our prompt. How much would you like to transfer? And in this case, I'd like to transfer $100. So now the new value is 900 from savings that got transferred into checking, which is 600. So there are a couple issues with this coding here, and I'd like to look at the broader picture. If we look at this, we can see repetition in the input function. This means that it doesn't need to be inside of both um, logical operators. What we can do is remove both of these and establish this variable prior to the logic because it's used within the same scope of the function and it's used inside of both logic. I don't know exactly what to call these, if statements, else statements, but really it's just logic control. What that does is it keeps your code from getting too complicated and repetitive. Now, this might not seem like a big issue here, but inside of larger projects, it gets to be really messy and really makes it hard if you're working on a large team because it might be confusing to other people why you have to establish the same variable multiple times, and you might be doing different things with that. Now, another thing I see here is more repetition with the float. In every case, we're always adding the float of the amount, and we're not utilizing the amount in any case except for a float form. That means that we shouldn't need to do the float every single time we call it. In fact, we can establish the float as we're establishing the variable from the beginning. So we can wrap this input function in the float from the very start, and that way we don't need to worry about adding it to each of these amounts. Now if we run the program, it should run the same. Perfect, it still ran. But in this case, our code is a lot cleaner and it saved us some computation. These have been some good practices that we've been developing and prevent us from making mistakes as we grow better as Python developers. I hope this video was able to help you, and if you have any suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comments. If you have any questions, also feel free to leave them, and if you have any recommendations, feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you for watching and have a good one.